by Randall Sullivan with new material, apparently. I don't know, I didn't read the original, so I don't know. But it's a History Channel book, I think. And anyways, I had seen it kind of pop in and out of my life. For some reason, this book kept coming up, and I just decided to get it on a whim. So I don't know if it's good or interesting, exciting. I'm not sure. We're gonna have to find out together. But if it's not that interesting, then this will be a great opportunity for you to take a nap or go to sleep or whatever it is that you'd like to do during this time. But hopefully it's good. So anyways, let's just get right into it. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff. If you want to stay connected and continue to see videos like this, I am going through all of your requests that I have received so far. It's just taking me a little bit of time, but I'm getting through them. And as always, just thank you so much for your support. It is appreciated beyond words. And I promise I will get to all of your comments as soon as I can. Just a lot of juggling going on at the moment, but you know how it is. Okay, so let's jump into The Curse of Oak Island, the story of the world's longest treasure hunt. I'm going to try to get through the introduction and the first chapter. It's a little long, so we'll see. But that's my plan, and thank you guys for being a part of the ride of this new book that I got. Sorry, my nails look absolutely atrocious at the moment. I forgot to touch them up before this video. Oops. Okay. To Gabriel and Grace, whose searches I hope will all lead to discoveries. There's just this picture of a map. Just figured I'd show it off. This book doesn't really have pictures or anything, though. Okay. Introduction. Here we go. 13 years ago, I began an article for Rolling Stone magazine with these lines. Can what's buried beneath the ground on Oak Island possibly be worth what the search for it has already cost? 6 lives, scores of personal fortunes, piles of wrecked equipment, and tens of thousands of man-hours have been spent so far, and that's not to mention the blown minds and broken spirits that lie in the wake of what is at once the world's most famous and frustrating treasure hunt. Still a pretty strong opening, I'd say, and the question remains a valid one. The article was published in the magazine's January 22nd, 2004 edition, and every comment I heard about it was positive. I was not entirely satisfied with the piece, however, especially as time passed. I knew I'd left things out. Magazine deadlines force one to work fast, and the limited space in the pages of any periodical compels writers to make tough choices and sharp cuts, or to let editors make those choices and those cuts for them. It was the nagging thought that I'd accepted the semi-official legend of Oak Island without sufficient examination, though that truly bothered me. In the summer of 2010, I was working as the host of a show being produced for the Oprah Winfrey Network. Early on, Joe Nickel of the Skeptical Inquirer, perhaps the best-known naysayer in the country, was brought in to be my on-camera adversary. Nickel had written an article that attempted to debunk certain myths surrounding Oak Island, and we spoke briefly about this off-camera. I was acutely aware that I wasn't confident enough in what I knew about the historical record to refute some of what he was saying, obsessive-compulsives, crackpots, and the sincerely curious do it like no place on earth. None of this changed the fact, though, that Oak Island was a genuine enigma, and quite arguably one of the most mysterious spots on the planet. I wanted another shot at that place. I got one in the late spring of 2016 when I received a telephone call from the producers of the astonishingly successful cable television series, The Curse of Oak Island, inviting me to spend a month or so on the island while the show was shooting its 4th season in Nova Scotia that summer. It wasn't getting back on television that I looked forward to as much as getting back on Oak Island. That tiny dot of land off the coast of Nova Scotia haunted my imagination like no other place I'd been. That July, I headed back there for the first time since the autumn of 2003. I didn't delude myself into believing I was about to solve the mystery. All I aimed for was to tell the island story in a more comprehensive and entertaining way than any who had gone before me. But of course, I told myself one never knew what one might find when one started looking. So that is the introduction. Short, quick little intro. Now we're going to jump into chapter 1. Chapter 1. Which I believe is about 20 pages, so again, we'll see how far we get. I like it so far, though. Okay. Oak Island sits off the coast of Nova Scotia, just north of the 45th parallel, the halfway point between the equator and the North Pole, about 45 miles southwest of Halifax. It's almost a mile long and not quite a half mile wide at its broadest point, narrowing to only a little more than 1,000 feet at its sunken center, which is filled mostly with swamp and marsh. The island is commonly described as peanut-shaped, but when I've looked at it from above, I've always seen a baby elephant, mainly because of the curve of an incipient trunk that protrudes from its east end, wrapping around the southern shore of a compact crescent-shaped bay that was once known as Smuggler's Cove. Small hills of glacial drift, known geologically as drumlins, rise to about 35 feet above sea level on both ends of the island. The composition of the island's two sides is very different. On the east, layered with limestone, gypsum, and sandstone. On the west, mainly quartzite and slate. Because the geologic structures of the island's east and west ends are so dissimilar, and because the swamp divides them, some theorists think Oak Island was once two islands very close together that may or may not have been joined by the work of men. While there are more than 350 other islands in the churning silver-gray waters of Mahone Bay, it's not difficult to imagine why this one would have stood out to the mariners of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. It is larger than most of the other dots of land in those waters and very close to shore, barely 200 yards from a protrusion of the mainland that's been known for the past 2.5 centuries at Crandall's Point. What impressed the first Europeans to live in the Mahone Bay area, though, was that the island was covered with a magnificent forest of mature oak trees, with deep roots and stout trunks that supported massive spreading limbs, leaving most of the ground in the shadow of their canopy. It may have been the only island in Mahone Bay where oak trees grew, and certainly it was the only island covered with them. Those trees were what gave the island its eventual name, though it was designated simply as Island Number 28 by Charles Morris, the Surveyor General of the province, who between 1762 and 1765 conducted the first survey of the island and divided it into 32 4-acre lots. In 1776, a British cartographer named Desbars attempted to name it Gloucester Monroe, Lynch, and Seacombe, and populated a village they called Chester Township. On the south end of the bay, a mostly German and Swiss population was in the process of creating the great seagoing and shipbuilding town of Lunenburg, famous for the Georgian mansions topped with five-sided dormers that were the homes of sea captains in that epic of tall ships. The settlers in the Chester area, though, were mostly farmers, plus a few ambitious souls who prospered by building and operating lumber mills. Most of the trees on the other islands of Mahone Bay, and on the mainland as well, were evergreen softwoods. Spruce and pine predominated, making the island a primary source of hardwood timber. That a single island among the dozens in Mahone Bay should be covered with oak trees was for a period of 60 years or so the principal mystery of the place. The first to describe the island in print and to remark on its impressive forest of oak trees was a French nobleman named Nicolas Denis, who had helped establish Le Havre, the settlement at the entrance to Mahone Bay, in 1632. Denis could conceive of no explanation for how the oaks had gotten there. Gonna grab a sip of water. There, okay. Among the points driven home by a study of Oak Island is how much of what we call history is hearsay and supposition, conflation, and apocrypha. Even revisionists go back to the earliest written sources created by men who were putting to paper what they'd heard from people who were themselves often repeating stories they'd been told by somebody else. Historians since the time of Herodotus and have been deciding what version of events to include and what version to leave out. Readers can only hope they've chosen wisely. If one person is identified as the first to discover the works on the island, the name Daniel Mcinnis is almost unanimously put forward. As the story is told, Mcinnis was 16 years old in the late spring of 1795 when he rode to Oak Island one fine morning to explore it all alone. It was still early in the day, the story goes, when the teenager stumbled upon an unusual saucer-shaped depression in the earth, about 13 feet in diameter on the elevated ground of the island's east drumlin. The forked limb of the giant oak extended over the clearing, cut off at a point where its two branches were still almost as thick as a man's thigh. Attached to the limb, about 15 feet above the ground, was a weather-worn wooden tackle box that was held in place with a wooden peg or tree nail of the type used in the construction of wooden ships. Taking all of this in, young Mr. Mcinnis surmised that he had happened upon the hiding place of a pirate treasure. During the 17th and early 18th centuries, when buccaneers terrorized shipping lanes across the globe, Mahone Bay had been one of the world's great pirate havens. Tales of buried treasure were endemic to the region, but the legends that surrounded Oak Island were particularly ominous. According to several of Nova Scotia's numerous amateur historians, the citizens of nearby Chester Township had for years shared stories of strange lights that glowed on the island. After dark. Author Edward Rowe Snow, who embraced this bit of apocrypha as historical fact, wrote that a number of fishermen claimed to have seen on the island human figures silhouetted against bonfires, as one local chronicler put it. Eventually, Snow had written 2 men overcome with curiosity had ventured out to Oak Island to investigate. They never returned. Daniel Mcinnis did make it back to Chester, according to the story, where he recruited 2 young friends, also teenagers, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan, to help him dig for the treasure he was certain must have been buried at this mysterious spot on Oak Island. The hanging from the forked limb of the oak tree. But it slipped off the tree nail and fell to the ground, where it shattered into powdery fragments, suggesting to the boys that it must have been very old. They went to work on the ground then, armed with pickaxes and shovels. They had reached the depth of only 2 feet, though, when they hit a tier of carefully laid flagstones. They would later decide, after some investigation, that the rocks were not from Oak Island, but instead had been moved there from Gold River, about 2 miles north of the mainland. Eagerly tossing the stones aside, Mcinnis and his friends found themselves at the entrance to a large shaft. The sides were made of hard-packed clay, but the earth inside was loose and easy to shovel. Driven by the excitement of discovery, the 3 dug within a few days to a depth of 10 feet, where they struck solid wood. Assuming they had hit the top of a treasure chest, the teenagers shoveled feverishly, only to discover that what they had found was a level platform of oak logs, all about 6 to 8 inches in diameter, the ends of which had been embedded in the walls of the shaft. Removing these, the boys kept digging over the next few days, clearing out the loose soil with a pickaxe, 2 shovels, a rope, and a bucket. When they hit solid wood for a second time at 20 feet, the 3 again dug feverishly, convinced that this time they really had found the top of a treasure chest. What they had struck with their shovels, though, was another tier of oak logs, with their rotting ends embedded in the sides of the shaft, exactly as the logs at 10 feet had been. At that point, the 3 looked up at the walls of clay towering above them and realized that even a partial collapse would bury them alive. It was agreed that they needed to mount a much more substantial operation, involving both a far larger workforce and more expensive materials and equipment if they were to go deeper into the shaft. The 3 youngsters bought land on Oak Island, as the story goes, where they supported themselves as farmers while making regular trips to nearby towns, seeking out men of means who might help them recover what they were calling Captain Kidd's treasure. I had returned to Nova Scotia, determined to test every major theory and to question all received wisdom about Oak Island. After 4 weeks of research, assisted by, among others, the Nova Scotia Archives, the South Shore Genealogical Society, and local historian Charles Barkhouse, I was convinced that the tale was mostly true. This is not to say entirely true. There were a number of details in the narrative that I either doubted or was convinced couldn't be right, and several others that I believed might be embellishments, added as the story was told and retold. For the moment, I was leaving aside the deepest mystery of who was behind the works on Oak Island and concentrating instead on the story of how those works had been discovered. Even then, the best answers I could find to my questions about who, what, and when were so unclear that nebulousness may have been their most defining feature. At least I didn't have much doubt that the first to find the massive hole in the ground, now world famous as the Money Pit, had been the young man Daniel Mcinnis. While Mcinnis himself was dead by the time the treasure hunt on Oak Island hit high gear in the mid-19th century, his former partners Vaughn and Smith had been alive to describe what took place on the island in the early days, dating back to the discovery of the Money Pit, to those who produced the earliest written accounts. Both said there was no question Daniel was the first to spot the features that had inspired the 3 of them to start digging. Who Daniel Mcinnis had been, though, was still a puzzle with a lot of missing pieces to me. Mcinnis was described as an enigma by R.V. Harris, the lawyer whose 1958 book, The Oak Island Mystery, had made the Money Pit story known outside Nova Scotia. His age in 1795 is unknown. His origin and parentage is unknown. So where had the story of the 16-year-old boy who discovered the Money Pit come from? From Anthony Vaughn, mostly, it seems. 1862 edition of the Liverpool Transcript, a now defunct weekly newspaper that was distributed throughout southern western Nova Scotia during the mid and late 19th century. Vaughan had actually told his story at length more than 12 years earlier in an 1849 interview with a devout Presbyterian named Robert Creelman, who was a member of the treasure hunting group known as the Truro. The author who made use of the Creelman interview for the transcript article was Jotham, sometimes called Jotham B. Macaulay, who had been part of both the Truro Company and the Oak Island Association, separate treasure hunting groups that had worked on Oak Island between 1849 and 1865. Macaulay may have also written the second and far more detailed published account of the discovery of the money pit, which appeared in 3 consecutive editions of the Halifax tri-weekly called The Colonist in January 1864. Although the author was identified only as a member of a team that had searched for treasure on Oak Island in 1861, the transcript and colonist articles each had relied on interviews with John Smith, who died in 1857, as well as those Creelman had conducted with Anthony Vaughan. But Smith was apparently had been more taciturn than his old friend. Not so Smith's daughter Mary, who worked as the housekeeper for Judge Mather Biles des Brisay, the county magistrate and local eminence who authored History of the County of Lunenburg. Originally published in 1870, which included a 2-page account of the discovery of the money pit that was the first to appear between hardcovers. Mary Smith, apparently quite voluble, had told Judge des Brisay the story from her family's perspective on multiple occasions. Those 3 accounts, published 67, 69, and 75 years after the putative date of the money pit's discovery, were the core versions of the Oak Island story before Harris's book was published. There were, of course, various documents and records dating back to the early 19th century that related to the assorted treasure hunting companies that had formed to attempt the recovery of whatever might be buried on Oak Island. And the scene at the money pit had been briefly described in an 1863 volume titled Rambles Among the Blue Noses, written by British author Andrew Learmont Spadon, whose aim was to amuse the people back home with tales from the provincial wilds of eastern Canada. There was also an account of the discovery of the money pit, written in 1866 by one Israel Longworth, but his work, History of the Country of Colchester, had never been published, and only a fragment remained of the manuscript written in 1863 by another early treasure hunter, James McNutt, that described the early search for treasure on Oak Island. So the early story of the treasure hunt on the island was based largely on the recollections of Anthony Vaughan and Mary Smith, along with various others who claimed to have heard it from Daniel Mcinnis and John Smith. This paucity of sources and questions about their reliability have fueled rampant speculation about what really happened on Oak Island in those early days. Everything from the allegation that the 3 young men cooked up a story to cover their tracks after finding a huge treasure trove on Oak Island, to claim that Mcinnis, Smith, and Vaughan were the front men for a conspiracy of Yankee loyalists operating a smuggling operation out of Oak Island during the Revolutionary War. The evidence offered to back up these and the dozens of other alternative theories of what took place on Oak Island in the last years of the 18th century is, of course, even more meager than the evidence that supports what has become the more or less official version. R.V. Harris wrote in The Oak Island Mystery that most of what could be actually known about Daniel Mcinnis's background had to be delivered from the origins and lineages of Vaughan and Smith, whose family histories were much easier to find in Nova Scotia's early public records. In my opinion, no one was in a better position to make such an assertion than Harris, who had served as the attorney to two men who drove the treasure hunt on Oak Island for 70 years, between 1895 and 1965, and who had inherited and relied on the vast collection of records and documents that now made up the bulk of the huge Oak Island file at the Nova Scotia Archives in Halifax. So I took his advice. I began with Vaughan. Government and church records established that he was the son of an Anthony Vaughan Sr., who had come to Nova Scotia from Massachusetts in 1768 to claim his piece of the British Crown's Shoreham Grant, 200 acres on the mainland almost directly across from Oak Island. Anthony Vaughan Jr. was 13 years old in 1795, which offered at least some tangential confirmation that his friend Daniel Mcinnis probably had been a teenager also. Judge Desbrizay, in his book, described Vaughan and his family as living on the mainland in 1795, and that jibes with what other early writers, up to and including R.V. Harris, have mentioned. But there was little question in my mind that the boy's family owned land on Oak Island well before the discovery of the money pit. There are deeds that show Anthony Vaughan Sr. acquired lots 15 and 17 on Oak Island in 1765, which wouldn't seem possible if he had emigrated to Canada in 1768, and lot 14 in 1771. One of Vaughan Sr.'s brothers bought lot 13 in 1781. It is also clear that the Vaughans were operating a lumber mill on the mainland, directly across from Oak Island. In 1788, they petitioned the Surveyor General of Woods in the province of Nova Scotia for permission to cut down sundry pine trees on 900 acres of land for the purpose of farming the land and milling the trees. So there seems little doubt that by 1795 the Vaughan brothers were using or intended to use the trees on their Oak Island properties as timber for the mill, and that Anthony Vaughan Jr. must have had some familiarity with the island. John Smith was almost certainly living on Oak Island in 1795. In fact, he may have been born there, but it appears more likely that he moved to the island in 1786 at the age of 11. Born on August 20th, 1775, he would have been 19 years old in the spring of 1795. More my support in mind that Daniel Mcinnis really was 16 years old or so at the time. Smith's family, like Vaughan's, had come to Mahone Bay as part of the Shoreham Grant immigration, and Edward Smith, who was more likely, though not certainly, an uncle of John Smith's father, had acquired the title to Oak Island's Lot 19 on March 8, 1768. John Smith himself made a first appearance in the public record on September 28, 1790, when he married at age 15 one Sarah Floyd. He next publicly registered his existence on June 26, 1795, when he purchased Lot 18 on Oak Island from a Chester merchant named Caspar Wollenhupft for 5 something. I'm not sure what this symbol is. Maybe euros, but I don't think so. It was the plot of land where the money pit was located. That purchase seems to have been the main basis for the claim that the money pit had been discovered in the late spring of 1795, the assumption being that Smith had bought the property to secure access to the presumed treasure. Not unreasonable, but far from conclusive. But back to Daniel Mcinnis. I was distracted briefly by the claims of a handful of amateur historians, and the subject of Oak Island is beset by literally thousands of amateur historians who doubted that such a person as Daniel Mcinnis had actually ever existed, their claim being that Smith and Vaughan families had used this fictional character as a front to cover their own secretive activities on the island. Judge Desbrizay had described Daniel Mcinnis as one of the earliest settlers on Oak Island, but there is no record of anyone named Mcinnis owning property on the island prior to 1795. Some of the doubters pointed out that there was no Daniel Mcinnis listed on the records of the poll tax imposed on Nova Scotians by the British Crown in 1791, person, also pointed out that no grave marker with this name had ever been found in Lunenburg County. The early newspaper accounts, though, had described Mcinnis as having been buried on Oak Island, and there is to this day a collection of rocks on the drumlin where the money pit is located that could very well mark his final resting place. A shard of broken stone from that pile was found to have letters and numbers that could have been consistent with the name, the date of birth, and the date of death of a Daniel Mcinnis. On top of that, records existed of various Mcinnises living on Oak Island throughout the 1800s. And on the southwest end of the island were the remains of the foundation for a home that had been described since the beginning of the 20th century as the Mcinnis Place. Finally, I consulted a volume titled Families of Western Shore, recommended to me by the South Shore Genealogical Society as the most accurate source available. There was a lengthy section in the most recent edition of the book on the Mcinnis, a clan that began in the late 18th century and ended in the late 20th, when a book was published. The first entry described the arrival of Nova Scotia of a Donald Daniel Mcinnis, a planter of Welsh descent who came to Chester from New England with, among others, the Vaughan brothers, in or around the year 1772. Mcinnis, whose family name became Mcinnis at some point before the end of the 18th century, was described as having settled on Oak Island. The only confusing entry was one showing that Mcinnis had been awarded a crown grant of 100 acres near Chester in 1784, which suggested that was when he came to Nova Scotia, rather than the South Shore Grant immigrants who had arrived in 1772. I'm sorry if you can hear my radiator going off right now. It should be kind of like a white noise, if anything, but I unfortunately don't have any control over the sounds that it makes, and it can be a little clunky, so I'm sorry about that. And I'm probably just gonna read a few more paragraphs because I'm only halfway through the first chapter, and this video is already almost 40 minutes long. But we'll go for a little bit longer, and if you guys like this and want me to continue reading it, I certainly can. It seems like it's a little heavy on dates and information. I personally think it's interesting, but it's also a lot, and might be losing some people, so you'll have to just let me know what you think, and if you want more of this book or a different book, I have lots of books. Okay. My bearings were further shaken when Carly Marash, who runs the museum on Oak Island, gave me a copy of a document that had been prepared by the Mcinnis family that she said showed Daniel Mcinnis had been 36 years old at the time of the money pit's discovery. These family members had relied mainly on three documents: an application for compensation for losses suffered during the American Revolutionary War that was dated April 7, 1785, a related submission to the Honorable Lord Commissioner of His Majesty's Treasury, dated February 17, 1785, and the application for a memorial to Donald Mcinnis, captain of the North Carolina militia. On the basis of those, the family had created a timeline for Donald Daniel Mcinnis, yes, yet another spelling, that followed him from his birth in Scotland in 1759 through his immigration to America in 1770, his residence with his parents in North Carolina, his enlistment in the ranks of the Loyalists in 1776, when the Revolution broke out, his service under General Agnes MacDonald, and then with Lord Charles Cornwallis, his command of a gunboat in Charleston, South Carolina, and his eventual relocation to Nova Scotia in or around the year 1785. The final event listed on the timeline was the man's attendance of the baptism for his grandson, Johann James Mcinnis, in Chester in 1795. I was flummoxed. The words in this book are words I've never seen. When I went back to the families of the Western Shore, however, I found that the genealogy in that who had found the money pit site in 1795. The only explanation I could come up with was that either Carly or the McGuines descendants had confused Daniel Mcinnis, discoverer of the money pit, with his father. But what about the claim that family records showed Donald McGuines attending the baptism of his grandchild in Chester in 1795? That might be accounted for by the other available 18th century document relating to either Donald or Daniel McGuines in Nova Scotia, found in the archives of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. A copy of the record of the marriage of Donald Daniel McInnis to Maria Barbara Saller at St. James Anglican Church in Lunenburg on September 8, 1795. Daniel Jr. was supposed to have been 16 when he found the money pit a few months before that date, but a marriage later that year hardly seemed out of the question, given that his friend John Smith had been only 15 when he married. But what about the alleged baptism? Of the one grandson of Donald McGuines. I went back to families of the Western Shore, where both a sense of relief and a conviction that I could be done chasing the ghost of Daniel McInnis, I discovered a reference to a document recording the baptism of one James Johann McInnis, son of Daniel and Maria Barbara in Chester, on July 26, 1797. I was satisfied that I had a working model of who Daniel McInnis had been and where he had come from, the son of a Scottish or Welsh father who came to America as a boy, lived with his family in North Carolina, joined the Loyalist side of the Revolutionary War, and emigrated to Canada after the British surrender, accepting the grant of the 100 acres near Chester that he worked as a farmer. If Daniel Sr. had been born in 1759, then it made sense that Daniel Jr. might have been born 20 years later in 1779, which would have made him 16 years old in 1795. The story held up, but only to a point. It seemed clear that the tale of young Daniel McInnis rowing out to a mysterious, uninhabited island, where he was startled by the discovery of a weird depression in the ground, was not exactly how things had really happened. In 1951, the Nova Scotia Bureau of Information, a government agency that no longer exists, published the first official account of the Oak Island story. The document's concise summary of the money pit's discovery reads as follows. Anthony Vaughn, Jack Smith, and Dan McGuines, on a shooting trip to Oak Island from the neighboring mainland, found an aged oak with a sawed short limb from which dangled a stout line and a pulley. Under the tree was a depression in the ground, apparently man-made. Among the many problems with the account is that Oak Island was inhabited in 1795 by John Smith and his family, among others. It was possible Smith had owned Lot 18 on Oak Island when the money pit was discovered at some date after June 26, 1795. One account of the pit's discovery placed the year as 1799. Daniel McInnis might have rowed out to the island, almost certainly had rowed out to the island, if he wasn't already living there. But it could have been for the purpose of visiting his friend John or doing some work for John's family. Or maybe he was tracking game. Frederick Blair, the dominant figure in the Oak Island treasure hunt from the late 19th century through the middle of the 20th, and the greatest research of the Oak Island story, wrote that McGuines had been partridge hunting when he found the money pit. Other accounts say that he was cutting trees for either Smith or Vaughn when he stumbled upon an anomaly that would launch what has become the largest and longest treasure hunt in human history. What exactly that anomaly had been was yet another question for which a variety of answers had been offered. The account of the discovery in Judge Desbreze's book read, McInnis one day discovered a spot that gave evidence of having been visited a good many years earlier. There had been cuttings away of the forest, and oak stumps were visible. One of the original oaks was standing with a large forked branch extending over the old clearing. To the forked part of this branch, by means of a tree nail connecting the fork in a small triangle was attached an old tackle block. Mcinnis made known his find to his neighbors. No mention of a large circular depression. Also, Desbreze's account made it sound as if Mcinnis was living on the island at the time, as were his neighbors, Smith and Vaughn. Only when all three went back to the spot the next day did they notice that the ground beneath the tackle block had been settled and formed a hollow. According to Desbreze, who wrote that the three cleared away the young trees and removed the surface soil for about 2 feet before finding the tier of flagstones in the entrance to a shaft. The first newspaper account written by Macaulay for the Liverpool Transcript also described Mcinnis as initially being curious about the stumps of old oak trees crowned with thick mats of moss, and then noticing that the trees growing among the stumps were younger than the other oaks in the forest. The descriptions of the oak stumps and young trees seemed especially significant to me because, if true, they almost certainly ruled out a number of theories of Oak Island that had been offered over the years, some of them dating back 1,000 years or more. There is no way, and arborists hired by the Curse of Oak Island have confirmed this, that Mcinnis would have noticed either the oak stumps or the young trees if the cutting away of the forest had occurred centuries earlier. To me, that almost certainly meant that whoever was responsible for the original excavation in that spot had done the work no earlier than the 17th century. This considerably shortened the long list of candidates who had been proposed by literally dozens of theorists. Okay, and oh my gosh, there's only 2 more pages. I think I'm just going to keep reading it. This is such a long video, but I want to finish the chapter. Okay, let's go. Let's continue. We got this. We can do it. The Colonist Articles of 1864 was possibly written by Macaulay, made less of the oak stumps than of the 3 remaining oak trees that grew in an equilateral triangle around the money pit. This book is so specific. Oh my god. The articles make it clear that those 3 trees were what marked the ground between them. The Colonist Articles also state that after observing the triangle of trees, Mcinnis noticed that the bark of each trunk had letters and symbols carved into it. This description appears in no other early account of the money pit's discovery. Among the many questions raised by those early accounts is this: just what kinds of oak trees were growing on Oak Island back in 1795? The original trees are long gone, mostly killed off by an infestation of black ants during the 19th century. R.V. Harris had noted that a number of his sources, apparently with a view to adding more mystery to their stories, have been stated that this species of oak does not grow elsewhere in Nova Scotia, that they are southern trees found no farther north than Louisiana. Also, at least 2 historians who authored books on the subject of piracy and mentioned Oak Island in their words, one being Charles B. Driscoll, whose Doubloons is regarded in Canada as a classic work, had written that the trees on the island were the species known as live oak, an evergreen oak found only in the southern United States. Harris, though, asserted that the trees on the island were undoubtedly red oaks, which do grow on the Nova Scotia mainland. He cited the autopsy of one of the last surviving old oaks on the island, a wounded tree that had been cut down in 1931 and examined critically with a view to determining its age and the cause of the injury. Embedded deep in the tree's trunk, those who cut it open found the tip of a thick knife blade that had broken off inside of it. When the rings of the tree were counted outward from the blade, it was determined that at least 183 years had passed since the wound was inflicted, which Harris claimed as support for his theory that the pit was constructed between 1650 and 1750. Some later investigators would point out that those who had identified the trees on the island not as red oak whose anonymous author had visited the island by motorboat during the summer of 1951. The bare branches of 3 large dead oaks tower above the evergreens east of the Pirate Cove, and there are a few standing large dead oaks around the corner on the southern side of the island. There are a few other oaks in leaf, but all much smaller. Those who insist the trees on Oak Island were brought north in wooden ships and planted there make much of the fact that the recovered fragment of the McNutt manuscript asserted that the first thing Daniel Mcinnis had noticed that caused him to stop and consider the money pit location was a circle of red clover growing in the spot, a variety of clover that was not native to Nova Scotia. This claim about the red clover and other non-native plants growing around the money pit was repeated in T.M. Longsworth's To Nova Scotia, published in 1935. What most confused me about the 19th century descriptions of the money pit's discovery was part of the tackle block. When I'd first heard the story of the wooden pulley fixed to the oak tree branch that hung over the money pit, I'd reflexively dismissed it as apocrypha. If some group of people had gone to the massive effort of performing the extraordinary work on Oak Island for the purpose of concealing a treasure for which obviously they planned to return at some later date, it did not make sense that they would have been so careless as to leave an obvious tell. And yet the story of the tackle block attached to the forked branch of the oak by a tree nail had been repeated in every early account of the discovery of the money pit. I had a sense it must be true. But if it was true, this meant that whoever had dug the money pit in the first place had wanted it to be found. That seemed even more certain if one accepted as accurate an early account attributed to Anthony Vaughan that there were carved marks and figures on the trunk of the oak near its base. What Mcinnis, Smith, and Vaughan did after they gave up digging in the money pit by themselves is easier to know than what happened earlier, because the 3 young men were by then intent on involving others in their treasure hunt. First, though, they took precautions to protect their find. Before they went in search of a partner or partners who would help them mount a more extensive excavation, the 3 teenagers marked the depth their dig had reached, loosely refilled the bottom of the pit with dirt, surrounded it with oak sticks driven into the mud, then covered those over with branches from young trees that they had felled. They also searched the island. Their most significant find was left of an old road, which is Judge Desbreze's description. Another writer called it a rough path that led to the money pit site. In Desbreze's account, the 3 actually found the road before they started digging, and that discovery seems to have been what convinced Smith and Vaughan that their friend Mcinnis really had found something. Besides the road or path, the discovery that seems to have most excited the 3 was a large iron ring bolt they found at low tide on an eastern cove of the island, embedded in a rock. The 3 assumed it was where the ship had tied up while the pirates had buried their treasure. Though there is no clear record of when Mcinnis purchased his property on Oak Island, it seems clear from the recollections of others that Mcinnis, after marrying, built himself a house on the southwestern part of the island and farmed the land. We're almost there. Smith, already married and the owner of Lot 18, built himself a house near the money pit and proceeded to acquire lots 16, 17, 19, and 20, giving him ownership of the entire 24-acre eastern end of the island. Vaughan, by every account, lived on the mainland even after marrying. This is perhaps why, after an intervening period of 7 or 8 years, it was Vaughan who found the partner who had organized the first well-financed assault of the money pit. The early accounts offer multiple explanations of why it took so long. Only those willing to work 12-hour days could make a life on Mahone Bay during that time, and neither the young men nor the neighbors had the time, the energy, or the money to reopen the money pit and try digging deeper into it. Others have argued that people were afraid of Oak Island. Word that Mcinnis, Smith, and Vaughan claimed to have found a spot where pirate treasure was buried had produced an oft-repeated local legend that the buccaneers settlers killed a black slave and left his ghost to guard their treasure. There were also stories that a witches' coven met on the island and cast curses on anyone who dared to visit. But the simplest and therefore most likely explanation was that the three young friends kept their mouths closed about what they had found and waited for an encounter with a person of means they believed could help find the treasure. In retrospect, what seemed most remarkable is that Mcinnis, Smith, and Vaughn never seemed to have wavered in their belief about who had buried that treasure. So there you have it, Chapter 1 of The Curse of Oak Island. Quite a long chapter. I did not realize it would take so long. But let me know what you think, if you like it so far. Again, I find it, pretty interesting. There's a lot of dates and names and things that I can, sometimes get lost in with any kind of book like that. But it is really informative, and I think it's going to get juicier as we go on. When we find out more of the story and the people who have tried to uncover this treasure and whatnot. So, I don't know, we'll see. But again, let me know if you want more of this or a different story. I've been reading lots of books lately, trying to educate myself, but I wanted to pick something out that felt kind of fun and mystical. Like a treasure hunt seems like kind of a fun, fantastical read, so that's just my opinion. But anyways, that's really all I have today. I hope you enjoyed this video and my fuzzy mic cover, making a reintroduction. I'll probably keep it on because, I don't know, it's kind of relaxing. But again, I hope you're doing well. Let me know what you want to see next.